Item. Good morning. Today is the July 9th, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. Our agenda this morning has a few big topics. We will hear from subcommittee member Alyssa White on some of the research work she's done related to agricultural resilience and climate change and soil health. Then we'll spend the majority of our meeting talking about how to move forward towards our July 26th deadline to deliver our initial recommendations to the Climate Council. We've got some time for some unstructured conversation amongst the group, and then we'll hear from the public and be done for the day. So our first agenda item is to approve that agenda and the meetings from last week. Any comments, questions, edits on that from subcommittee members? All right, looking good. So we will consider those approved. And right on time, we will move on to Alyssa. Alyssa, let me know if you need any help from us to facilitate your conversation.
Great, thanks, Billy. And just thanks for the opportunity to share some of the insights from our research that are relevant to this group. I will try to share my screen and just let you know that, let's see. Is that shared yet? Oh no. This presentation is.
You're shared now, yes.
Great, okay. So there's two parts to this presentation. There's a lot of different research that I've been attached to that is really relevant to the work of this subcommittee. And I just have about 20 minutes to share a little bit more in depth about two pieces that I think are important for you to be aware of. The first part is about some research we're doing right now on soil health and soil carbon stocks in the state of Vermont. And so I just want folks to know about that project and hear about some early insights. And this first part of the presentation are with collaborators Brenda Bergman from the Nature Conservancy and Heather Darby from UVM. And then the second portion of the second 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about some research that I did with farmers across the Northeast on adaptation and resilience to climate change, which I think really has very specific implications for the kinds of recommendations that we can make as this subcommittee. So as folks know, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Gund Institute Environment. I work with UVM Extension, primarily with Heather Darby. And if I can get myself set up here, I'll advance the slide. There we go. Okay, so this first project that I'm going to tell you is the State of Soil Health Project. And it's just begun this year in 2021. And our goals really were just to bring together all of the different folks and actors that are interested in soil health for so many different reasons. Soil health is having this kind of a big moment right now. It's very charismatic because really not much that's bad about soil health so far. And so the concept here was really to give us some baseline information about where we're at in terms of soil health across the agricultural landscape, because folks are talking about all these different initiatives to increase soil health, but if we don't know where we're starting from, it's kind of challenging to talk about enhancement and what that actually means. So our goal was to really set a baseline, not just for carbon stocks, but for all these other soil health indicators that are associated with ecosystem services. And this is relevant to the PES working group work. The second goal was to create kind of standards for soil sampling across lots of different projects so that we can have comparable data and kind of aggregate that at the state level. And then our goal is also to share information back to farmers that gives them more contextualized information about soil health in their farms. The evaluations to understand some of the more nuanced pieces of soil health are a little bit expensive. And then we're also, one of our goals is just to support greater collaboration across all the different folks that are working on aspects of soil health with farmers across the state. And so we've brought in a number of different collaborators in this project. Of course, the Gund Institute and UVM Extension, Ben and Jerry's has funded part of this work. The Nature Conservancy Vermont has funded the soil carbon stock assessment piece of this work and our capacity to extend sampling to like a broader geographic range. The Vermont Environmental Stewardship Program is sharing data. We have some researchers from Dartmouth that are looking at certain aspects of soil carbon permanence, and then the conservation districts are also involved. The Marley Roop has given us some support. It really is just like a catch-all for everyone that's working on soil health in the state. So I want you to be aware of that as we've talked so much about soil health in this group. And so far this season, we've done sampling of soil health and soil carbon stocks on 165 fields, which is kind of a big lift. And that's really based on tapping into projects that were already happening in terms of evaluating soil health and soil carbon stocks. And then we looked at where those fields were and which farms were represented. And we took the kind of modest amount of money that we had and put that towards purposefully sampling the kinds of farms and the geographic extent of the state that was missing from that sample. And so we're hoping to be able to provide an assessment of soil health and soil carbon stocks. So we're measuring a lot of different stuff on all of these fields, which is really exciting. We're doing the Cornell assessment of soil health test, which is a pretty common and comprehensive assessment of many different aspects of soil health. On top of that, we're adding bulk density and soil organic carbon measurements to 30 centimeter depth so that we can get kind of the international standard for soil carbon stock assessments at the field level. We're looking at some really interesting biological indicators to give us a sense of who's in the soil and what kinds of carbon they're eating. And then our collaborators from Dartmouth are evaluating short versus long-term carbon portions in the soil. And there's a number of ecosystems we can talk about with this data, but today what I'm just gonna talk about in detail is our preliminary information about soil carbon stocks and what that means for climate regulation services. And to make sure that we're all on the same page, soil carbon stocks and organic matter content, although that is often used as kind of one of the base metrics for calculating that, it's really a measure of how much carbon is in a volume of soil. So the depth to which we measure really matters, and the area that we talk about matters. But in addition to the carbon content of the soil, we combine it with kind of the density of the soil. So if you can imagine a really thick loaf of rye bread as being really dense and having more weight or more mass in it versus like a nice light fluffy white bread, you'll have more carbon in a denser soil as you would with a denser bread than with a lighter bread. And so getting that bulk density measurement is a really important part of the work that we're doing. And that's one of the limiting factors in having empirical data on the ground about soil carbon stocks. It's not something that you can really like remotely sense. And even some of the efforts to do that using imaging data, I think are really limited, especially for the soils in the Northeast. Okay, so there is some existing data that we can look to give us some perspective. So the best existing data I think we have at the national level is this carbon assessment that the NRCS conducted in 2010. And they were looking to just get a baseline inventory of where we're at. They measured soil carbon and bulk density to get carbon stocks at 3 different depths in the soil. And the key insights from that work is that most of the carbon's occurring within the kind of the first foot of the soil. 30 centimeters is about a foot depth. They also found that wetlands across the country have the highest soil carbon stocks. And as you can see in this figure, the Northeast is really the highest soil carbon content when compared nationally. And that has to do with our climate and the finely textured kind of glaciated soils that we have here. Now that data set collected information just at 53 sites in Vermont, and you can see it's a little bit information, 27 in the forest land. And what we see here is that the mean or average value may not be the best indicator of where we're at because there are kind of these high outliers that kind of skew the mean. So the median might be a better indicator for this kind of data. But again, we see that wetlands and forests in Vermont have the highest soil carbon content, but agricultural soils, they are actually higher than the national average, and they offer an important opportunity to enhance soil carbon content. And so I think this, for our work as a group, I think it points one that we really need to work to protect and conserve those the soil carbon stocks in wetlands and forests in Vermont, and to work to enhance soil carbon in agricultural soils. So just to put some data behind that, I looked at this recent study about wetlands soil carbon stocks in wetland soils across the country. And we can see that our region has kind of the great carbon stocks in wetlands. So we're kind of like the richest. We have the richest banks. And that for our region, wetland soils store an average of 539 tons of carbon per hectare, which is huge. I think most ag soils, the average even high would be like 90 or so. So that's pretty exciting. And then when we look at soil carbon in Vermont forests, this is probably some of you have been involved in this work, but I just thought important to share with you today. So soils are the largest global carbon pool and are also that in Vermont forests. So Vermont forest soils hold, 152 tons of carbon per hectare, which is really important. And we can see that's much biomass. So just an important reference for our group here. And then what we found from the preliminary assessment of data from our field sampling effort this season in terms of agricultural soils, that hay fields have the greatest soil carbon stocks. Cornfields, which often I think get a bad rap and are assumed to be in tough shape, actually have pretty high soil carbon stocks compared to the rest of the group. Vegetable fields, not surprisingly, have lower soil carbon stocks. I think they're subject to a lot more disturbance and tillage. And this is, I'm sharing with you just how production style influences, the type of vegetable or the type of crop you're growing influences soil carbon, but we know that management and soil texture also have a strong impact. So we'll have more data to share with you eventually, but when we look at soil carbon content in terms of organic matter content in Vermont ag soils compared nationally, they are outstanding. The national average from that NRCS rapid carbon assessment data set is 3.2%, but all of the data sets available to us in Vermont show that Vermont ag soils have much higher organic carbon content standing. I mean, some of these, this top one, the UVM Ag and Environmental Testing Lab, that's over 9,000 samples, the average being 5.3. It's really incredibly high and exciting. Just noting that farmers in Vermont are good stewards and doing a good job. It's not just climate, soil, and soil texture, but also management that contribute to that outstanding level of organic matter. And this is just, I know this is maybe a little too much data for our short presentation, but this is just showing you these, a number of different data sets that we looked at to compare and understand where we're at in terms of organic matter content and how high we can go. So together, this is 6 different data sets accounting for 26,000 samples, and all of the means and medians are over 4% organic matter. And so that tells us we're pretty confident that organic matter levels are high in Vermont, but we can also do with that data is look at where the high ends are. So the high end of the interquartile range from all of this data is 6.4%, which means that's a really reasonable high end goal, and that gains are possible, even though we already have really high organic matter level content. And folks often talk about there being a saturation point, right? You can't just get soil carbon gains forever. They kind of hit a peak potentially. There's some debate about that, but it's good for us to understand how close we are to maybe maxing out or it being challenging to make more gains, especially in ag soils. And I think that given the data and the field work we've done this season, that we have quite a bit more room for growth. So that's exciting. And I'll just end this portion with this figure that Ryan shared last week. And this is a figure, it was just like a back of envelope calculation that I did to see how much impact enhancing soil organic matter in Vermont ag soils could have on the goals that we're trying to make, right? And so I looked at, some data from the state to see where we're at in terms of ag emissions and what the reductions needed were. And that's on the right here, the yellow, orange, and red show the amount of reductions we need in the ag sector by 2025, then 2030, and then 2050. And I made some assumptions about bulk density and looked at the amount of cropland that we have in this state. And on the far left here, this first column is if you increase soil organic matter just by 0.1% on all of the cornfields in the state, kind of the equivalent metric tons of carbon dioxide that would offset in the atmosphere. and this one is all hay fields, and the third is hay and cornfields. And so it's pretty significant. It looks great, and that's like the promise around this talk of regenerative agriculture and farms being part of the climate solution. But I just want to put a little caution on this piece. It's not the whole picture. Of course, these emissions are calculated annually, and that would mean if we were to use this as our only strategy, we'd have to be making those gains in soil organic matter annually. Right, it was just not a one-time gain in organic matter and 1% to really offset emissions. And so we can look at soil carbon as something that is, I think, really efficient and cost effective with lots of other benefits to farms and society that might help us meet our goals in the near term, but it will be harder to make those gains annually forever. And so it's kind of a strategy that I think fits into the short and near term planning for our group. The other piece is that this doesn't include the greenhouse gas emissions from the soil surface that can kind of offset those soil carbon gains from adding extra manure in certain types of ways. And so I don't have time to talk about all the research, but some of the research I've done at the field scale looks at soil carbon stocks and evaluating them against the soil surface greenhouse gas emissions. And in some systems, we've found that especially when manure is applied in kind of an anaerobic environment, those nitrous oxide emissions offset the soil carbon gains. And so to put those two pieces together, I think as Ryan suggested it in our overall calculations will be really helpful. But yeah, there's certainly nuances to this. And so I would say it's an important strategy for our group to pursue, but we just have to be careful about how much we promise. And so the next part of my presentation is about the climate resilience and adaptation research that I've done, but I just wanted to offer if Heather Darby or Brenda Bergman are here, who helped kind of with this first part, the State of Soil Health Project, if they want to offer anything that I've missed, unmute yourself and say hi.
Hey everyone, this is Brenda. I just wanted to say thank you, Alyssa, for all of this great work and for all the people who've been collaborating on this. I think you've covered well what we've discussed. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for coming. Okay, I'm sure Heather will pipe in if she's here. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of breeze through this next section and get to the point that the part that I think is most relevant to our group. So for my master's research, I worked on climate adaptation and resilience research across the Northeast with a number of different organizations at UVM and regionally. And there were kind of three phases to this research, which all have some insights for our group. The first, I interviewed agricultural advisors across New England about how they communicate with farmers about climate change, noting that that could be kind of politically charged or challenging, complex topic. We conducted a survey about how farmers are adapting to climate change in the Northeast. And then we ran these focus groups asking them to look at the results of that survey and give us advice on what resources they use and need to support their resilience to climate change. And I think that third piece has really just direct asks for folks like us that are making policy recommendations. All right, and so these are kind of the three big questions. One, how do we bridge this climate information gap? How are farmers adapting? And then what resources do they need to support resilience to climate change? And I think just the two key things from that first piece of research with extension professionals is they advised us to talk about climate change one level down from climate change, and really at the tangible and usable space of how it's impacting people. And I think that's advice that goes beyond the agricultural sphere, but instead of talking about how you're changing or managing for climate change, to talk about how you're changing things on your farm or in your forest to account for increased incidence of heavy precipitation events or drought. And so that I think that's just useful across the climate sphere. And then the other piece was that adaptation and resilience is very context specific. So the way that you're changing your farm or maybe your forest operation or your personal life to account for climate change or climate impacts is going to be different than others. So vegetable farms have very different adaptation strategies than maybe a livestock operation. There are some shared pieces, but to reframe information in context is useful. Now, in agriculture, the two leading causes of weather-related crop loss in our region are drought and excess moisture. And I think that points to kind of these two climate impacts of highest concern to agriculture, drought and heavy precipitation. And so we took this as advice to look at those specific climate impacts in our survey with farmers. And so this regional survey was done in 2017 and 2018. We had respondents from Canada to Pennsylvania, and we partnered with a number of different farmer organizations to conduct this survey. We really focused on how farmers are already adapting to those extreme precipitation patterns, which strategies they considered innovative and promising for moving forward, and a number of other questions. And I think we also asked them like agree and disagree questions about their capacity to adapt. And I think that's really interesting. So, you know, we asked this folks to agree or disagree on whether or not they understood their vulnerability to weather-related risks. And most people do. Most farmers understand how the climate and weather is impacting their farms. They may be the experts really in our society. They're dealing with it every day. But when we asked them if they had the knowledge and technical skill to address those risks, only 30% or 37% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed to having those skills. And so that's a place where we and others that work in capacity building for climate resilience can have some impact. And I think most importantly, only 18%, that's not many, of the respondents said that they had the financial capacity to deal with weather-related threats to the viability of their farm, including crop insurance. And so I think the financial vulnerability piece is a really important one for us to lift up and address. Okay, so I don't have time to go through like all of the different strategies that farmers use, but since the first part of the presentation was about soil health, it's important to note that farmers are already using soil health building strategies and cover crops to address climate related risks. So 74% of growers are already using cover crops and soil health to address heavy precipitation, and almost as many are using that to adapt to drought. And what's interesting about those strategies is that they're like kind of nuanced, right? People know how to use them, but they're also innovating on them at the same time. So we asked another question about what they thought the most innovative and promising strategies for adapting to climate change were. And one of the big themes was talking about soil health, like changing soil health practices, changing the way that they do cover crops, and investing in no-till. And so they noted that this has many different climate benefits from their perspective, and the science is behind this too, that healthy soils and better quality soils are more resilient both to drought events for lots. Okay, now to what I think is the most important part for our group is this third piece. The year after we did this survey, we took the results back to farmer conferences across the Northeast, from Prince Edward Island down to Pennsylvania, and we ran focus groups where we presented the survey results. And then we asked them questions about what resources they're using to support those adaptation strategies and what resources they needed. And there's 173 farmers participated in those conversations. And we talked about resilience as, in this group, people have given lots of different definitions of resilience, and I love that differentiation and in terms like that. And for this conversation, we really talked about resilience as a capacity to bounce forward or a capacity to adapt. And I think this idea of bouncing forward but not back is a nice analogy that is a little less academic in terminology. So we use that in the focus groups, really the goal of adaptation being to enhance the capacity to deal with the risks for themselves, from bounce back, move forward. All right, and so when we talked about what are resources for resilience, they kind of fit into some categories that reflect, maybe you've seen the community capitals framework or the livelihoods, sustainable livelihoods frameworks. So there are natural resources, physical resources, informational resources, financial, educational, and even these kind of like human skills or confidence and willingness to keep going. All right, and so here are kind of I'll offer two slides that are kind of the key results. So farmers primarily talked about investing in both kind of natural, like visible, physical, and built infrastructure on their farms and in their agri-ecosystems to deal with weather-related risks. Lots of different soil and water management strategies, crop production strategies. Really, the site level water planning was a big theme. Like, how can I change change the way that water moves on my farm, catch it when it comes in amounts, to prevent it from doing damage, and have it there stored for when I need it during times of drought. And they really asked for more site level water planning resources. Like, I need expertise. Like, I can't just figure this out. There's nobody really telling me and around water flows on my farm. And they also talked a lot about just like really appreciating the infrastructure, hoop house, and cost share programs that exist. So these are really the visible resources that we heard in those focus groups. But I think more interestingly is these invisible resources. So, you know, the Vermont Farm Fund was mentioned a lot. There are a number of these other kind of emergency relief funds that really supported farmers a lot from heavy impacts of climate change. They also talked about the way that their relationships with community members supported them in times of great loss. And I think that's really important to note, that those community relationships, that social capital, can potentially be like the most important factor at the whole systems level that enables them to change or persist in the face of big climate shocks. And not just social capital in terms of working with other community and neighbors, but also with other farmers. So peer learning, we actually found significant statistical influence on network affiliations with the adoption of no-till practices. And so we know that farmer networks are really important part of the picture, especially among farmer programs who don't have the capacity to engage in certain things. And so fitting the farmer networks into our understanding of adaptation and resilience resources is really important. Of course, they mentioned extension support as wishing there was more. Like, could every farmer have an extension specialist show up on their farm and talk to them about strategies that they could use? Cost sharing and grants, of course, and the development of reliable local markets. You know, some folks said we could absolutely continue to farm and deal with climate shocks and stressors if we knew that we didn't have to stress about farm viability, and we knew that there were consistent and high-paying markets for our, or at least adequately compensating markets for our products. Okay. Right, and so it's these kind of financial safety nets that and community relationships that are very important to farmers to help them recover from those extreme impacts. And so I think I'm going to finish up here just with this full circle picture of all of those resources I mentioned, the visible and invisible, which kind of fall into financial resources, natural and built resources, and these social and informational resources. And you know, farmers said they primarily are investing in the natural capital and built infrastructure, but when they get those big, heavy impacts, they really rely on financial safety nets and community relationships to help them recover. Let's see. Oh, and so it's important to note also that these resources play on each other. So the cost sharing and grants are critical to enabling farmers to invest in infrastructure on their farm. And then you might also think about how extension support and peer learning are, right now, that's where farmers are getting information to do planning. But, you know, and that site level water planning informs the way that they do soil and water management on farm. And so we can think about pieces of these as playing off each other and kind of building resources. But for us, what are the pieces outside the picture that we can add that enhance the resources that kind of that are catalysts for others? Okay, so I'm going to finish so that we can talk about this. But I apologize for going quickly. I would love to talk to you for an hour, but that is totally not what we're here to do. So thanks for giving me a couple minutes to share some of the work. And if there are pieces that I went too quickly or you'd like to see more in depth, just reach out. I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was really great, and appreciate it for you keeping it kind of short today. But, you know, certainly this is a topic we're going to keep working on, and I would hope we'd have opportunities in the future for you to come back in and kind of dig deeper into a lot of these topics. They're so relevant to our work. So thank you. I know there's a question in the chat from the public, but let's start off from subcommittee members. Do folks have any questions or comments or topics they'd like to discuss stemming from Alyssa's presentation? I think Judy and then Charlie.
Thanks, Alyssa. That was really great to hear. As you know, my definition of resilience and adaptation is slightly different. And so when you when you see that extension of support is important to them for to continue as they are, how does that add to bouncing forward instead of just maintaining?
Yeah, so farmers talked about how extension professionals were often the places they went to look for new strategies or to learn about new practices or programs that they could approach or engage with to support their transformation and kind of long-term planning. And so I think that extension support is certainly not just something that enables farmers to continue as they are, but also to change and transform in the face of climate change in all the ways that it impacts farms.
And hoop houses for farms in certain areas, like intervals and stuff, are very damaging to archaeological sites. Because their 3 feet of their pipe has to be in the ground. Is there awareness of that with the farmers?
I think that certainly the farmers in Vermont and the Burlington area are very aware of that. And I have noticed that there's a new focus of the NRCS to look at how like deep keyline plowing, for example, and hoop houses are impacting archaeological sites. And I think that there is probably not enough awareness, but there should be more. And the hoop houses, I think, were mentioned by farmers as being a really important strategy to protect them from both climate extremes. But we didn't ask them specifically about kind of drawbacks or considerations. And so it might be really interesting to make that a focus of future focus groups, like how can we get these adaptation benefits and also be more conscious of how we're interacting with traditional and historic uses of the land. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
That would be equitable for all, right?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Judy. Charlie, I think you're next, and Lauren.
Thanks, Alyssa. That was great. Two things that really kind of resonated with me were the idea of taking kind of these really kind of big, heavy, complex things like climate change and bringing it down to that level where somebody who's an actual steward of the land can understand, like, this practice I can wrap my hands around can actually help address that big, complex thing. And the other part of that is the peer-to-peer network idea. And I think that there's so much value in those models where you can bring, I mean, we've seen it on the forest side. And so it was really great to see that on the farmer side. And so I'd love to, at some point, either if you've got more kind of material in terms of what those models look like, or just dig into that more, because I think that's a really, like, the richness of that and the ability for them to kind of see what's happening on neighboring farms or like you said, the peer-to-peer, just an extremely great element. So glad to see that and hope to see more of that going forward.
Cool. Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, I actually, early in my master's, I did a review of peer learning programs for both forest and agriculture. And a lot of the publications are actually about forest peer learning programs. And so I'd be happy to share that with you.
Lauren.
Thanks, Alyssa. That was fantastic. You commented, one of the slides showed that there were between 74 and 76% of growers are currently already implementing adaptive strategies like no-till and cover cropping, which is really fantastic. Like, that's a really remarkable number or percentage. I wonder if you have the data that show what that translates to as far as percentage of ag land coverage, because 74% of growers is really big, but if it's mostly smaller acreage, that doesn't necessarily yield the same. Is there more impact opportunity in that 24%?
Great. Yeah, so the survey was conducted at the regional scale. We didn't ask farmers the amount of acreage that they're using those strategies on. We were really just looking for and trying to draw out what they're already doing and what they think was innovative and promising. I think that Ryan and the State Agency of Agriculture might have that kind of information at the state scale, or that they're working on looking at what acreage is already in cover crops. And it's also important to note that even though farmers are using soil health strategies or cover crops, that that there is a huge diversity within those strategies. And the way that you implement cover cropping has a huge impact on the functions and the outcomes. And so I think some of the research I'm working on with Heather, which we won't talk about today, is really at looking at where the leverage points are in cover crops in those outcomes that we care about. Because if you just seed downwind rye and you don't get good establishment, it might count as cover cropping, but it might not have those erosion control or nutrient reduction benefits that you're counting on. So sorry for the long answer. I don't have the data you want.
Okay, Abby.
Alyssa, thank you so much for presenting this. One, to Lauren's question, I would say too that, cover cropping or no-till only applies to people who are cropping or have open soil. And so it is a large number of farmers who are also managing acreage that is in permanent sod or perennial grasslands, which does not require tillage or cover cropping. And so that is something that we would want to consider as well, that acreage is, so that percentage only addresses a specific segment of practice. And Alyssa, I just want to thank you for presenting this. I feel these things out in the community, but to hear how you have been able to capture this and bring this forward is really, really helpful to understand how we could shape some things moving forward and where the potential leverage points are. And I'm really grateful for all of your work on this. It's amazing.
Thanks, Abby.
Great. Any other questions or comments from committee members right now? So just Alyssa, a couple questions that were in the chat. There's one question that said, is forest soils carbon content broken down anywhere into managed forest carbon and non-managed habitat forest?
That's an easy question to answer. I don't know. That's not something that our research was part of, and I'm sure we could look it up and offer some more insight into how managed and non-managed forest habitats influence soil carbon outcomes and other outcomes. I know that there are folks working on that right now at UVM, and I think it'd be easy to find that data. And I see this other question here about distinctions between conventional and organic agriculture. I think that one of the outcomes of this soil health baseline will give us some insight into that. And I will say that the prevailing hypothesis from some of the sustainable agriculture community is that organic agriculture has better soil carbon and soil health than other forms. And my first look at explanatory statistics shows that that is absolutely not the case. Even with the biological analyses we're doing, we see that cornfields that are managed conventionally also can have really high soil carbon and soil biological activity. And I think that's because there's just so much organic matter addition, so the manure piece, and that is an organic practice, but some of these things are not exclusive to organic agriculture, but we're excited to kind of dig into where the differences are. This story is not complete yet.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all that important work with us. And, as we kind of ruminate on it, I'm sure we'll have opportunities to go back to it and tap you for some deeper dives into some of these pieces. So thanks again to you and your collaborators. All right. So we're going to move on in the interest of time. It looks like our next agenda item is a conversation that Pat's going to help move us through, kind of gearing up to delivering our initial recommendations to the council at the end of this month. So take it away, Pat.
All right, thank you all. So we're gonna, as you remember from last meeting, we kind of tasked the task group leads to try to take the various kind of pathways or the organization of all the really great work that would happen in task groups and try to provide kind of an overarching umbrella, whatever, for all of us. So when we go to organize our work for the Vermont Climate Council, we've got somewhat of a consistent rubric for our pathways, which then you will slot your strategies under, and then there's a ton of actions, which we may or may not share yet with the Vermont Climate Council, but may give a flavoring to that. We'll talk about it in a bit. So what we thought we'd do today is first, Marion's just going to kind of describe broadly kind of what the Vermont Climate Council's guidance is for what they're expecting from you all July 26 or whenever it is. And then we'll talk through a few definitions to make sure we're clear on what strategy versus pathway versus action means. And then the task leads did some really good work to try to imagine our collective pathways that we could then organize ourselves under with already the good work that you've done. And I might, Lauren, if that's okay, might turn to her when we do that. I have some slides that Lauren or the task group leads can walk us through. But first, Marianne, maybe I turn it to you to kind of set the stage from the council's perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Pat, for setting that up. So I'll just give a brief overview of what we're looking for the council presentation on the 26th. And that will be a presentation from each of the subcommittees or task leads around the pathways and strategies that you all are recommending to the council for inclusion in the climate action plan. We're going to be using a pretty basic template that we've developed that gives a general overview of the process thus far, of the factors that we're considering when we think about pathways and recommendations, and then a space for the subcommittees to share some data or some broad level overviews that really support the pathways and strategies that you all are presenting to the council. That template is going to be shared and presented to the steering committee at their meeting this coming Monday. And once we have feedback from them, I'll be sending out that sort of finalized template with all of their final pieces of input incorporated, hopefully Monday afternoon or early Tuesday, for you all to start using to formatting for your work for the presentation. I don't have a good sense. I got this question at the cross-sector mitigation meeting yesterday about how much time folks will have to present at the Climate Council meeting on the 26th. I don't have that yet. We'll have that soon once I touch base with Jane next week on what we're looking at, but we'll share that as soon as we have it so you all sort of understand what the time frame is for presentation. As Pat will walk us through today, we're really looking at a presentation again from the subcommittees on pathways, which is really those broad level, what are we working towards? What are those things that we're coalescing around for the climate action plan? And then our strategies, which are what are those sort of steps that are going to get us to that pathway? Understanding that you all have done a fantastic amount of work and have already started to think about actions as well, which are really those specific programmatic planning initiative, funding sort of level details. I don't think we're going to get into that level of detail for presentation to the Climate Council at the end of July. That will be something that will come out later to the council, and we'll share what that looks like in more detail once we have that. So we'll really be looking at pathways and strategies and a presentation of that and the framework and sort of the work that you all did to get to those to the council in July. So happy to answer more questions, but hopefully that gives you all an overview of what we're looking for.
Great. Marianne, thank you. Any questions for Marianne? Then I'm going to show you all a few slides. All right, let's see here. Okay, everybody see these okay? Good. All right, so first, just to kind of emphasize what Marianne said, we added a little more to this too, is that one of the things I think that the task group leads we talked a little bit about is there are some important values you all have articulated, indirectly, implicitly, and explicitly sometimes regarding the work that you're doing. So we thought it might be really important to bring to the Climate Council, even though they haven't asked for it, a little bit of come to the values that undergird or the foundation or inform your work. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later this morning as we do that, just to kind of imagine that a little bit further. But that's one thought we just wanted to note. And then, again, as noted, pathways is kind of the highest level of organization. We'll offer definitions in a second. Then any number of strategies, then all the actions that might be needed, particularly that's really regarding implementation, right? And then I think sometime in this, probably the fall, people will begin to asking for measurable outcomes, which are more complicated for resilience and adaptation than they necessarily are for mitigation. But again, something that we'll want to begin to talk about. And we don't have to do that by the 26th, but want to note that. So I might, Marianne, back to you. We wanted to be as clear as we could be about definitions. So Marianne, I don't know if you want to say more about this slide, but I think these are the kind of working definitions right now you guys are using, right?
Yeah, so full disclosure, these are very much sort of draft definitions. We've kind of worked on compiling these, looking at the pathways definition that cross-sector mitigation is already using, and then the work that you all, Ag and Ecosystems and Rural Resilience, have been doing and sort of getting to pathways. I think the tough part is that each subcommittee is sort of at a different level of the process. And for cross-sector mitigation, they have a very specific definition because they have those mitigation reduction requirements they have to meet. So it is a little bit of a different approach for them. So what I tried to do was take take the information that the cross-sector mitigation is using for sort of their pathway definition, and then marry it with the work and sort of the actions that you all have taken as a subcommittee in working towards your pathways as well. But I will say again, the subcommittee hasn't seen, or excuse me, the steering committee hasn't seen these definitions yet. I hope to be able to share them with them on Monday, so they may change a bit, but this is really what we're sort of looking at and aiming towards in terms of the structure of pathways, strategies, and actions for the climate action plan. So when we think of pathways, this is, again, as I said earlier, just a really a high level means of what are we working towards? What are we trying to get to with the climate action plan, with the strategies and the actions and sort of the work that's gone into this. So it's that sort of setting the goal or that target for the high level means of how we're achieving our adaptation, resilience, sequestration, and then mitigation as well for the cross-sector mitigation strategies. So these may be written pretty broadly. I think that's what we're going to be discussing today, is what that looks like in formalizing that language. But they should also be, specific enough that you'll have strategies underneath them that are actually measurable, and you can sort of assess whether progress has been made in achieving them. So it's similar to a goal or vision statement. I want to be careful in saying goal because I know that we don't have sort of measurable outcomes yet identified for our sequestration and adaptation and resilience metrics, but we're really trying to show and use pathways as a way to coalesce around what are we trying to work towards for this climate action plan for resilience, adaptation, sequestration, mitigation, land management, and all of the things that you all are focusing on. So there's really kind of broad and aspirational places that we are trying to move towards that we can coalesce around and put strategies under in the climate action plan. So then moving beyond the pathway, a strategy is really a statement of measurable activity. It's that benchmark or that step that we're using to get to the pathway that we've defined. They should be more measurable and more specific than pathways. It's really the how. So we have the pathway, which is, we're trying to work towards healthy, natural, and working lands that sequester carbon. How are we going to do that? What are the steps we're going to take to get to that specific pathway? And then below that, we have actions, which are really those operational tasks or actions that need to be taken in order to reach the strategies and then the pathways. So ideally, this is, the who, what, when, where of the climate action plan that feeds into the how of the strategy. What are the programs we're trying to put into place or existing programs that we're trying to change? What are the organizations we're trying to work with? What are the funding sources we need to identify? Really that specific level detail of how we're trying to get to those strategies. And in looking at the presentations you all gave last week and the week before, you do already have some actions in there. And so if we need to, I can show it later on. I have a kind of a sample that pulled some of your language and how I would see sort of pathways, strategies, and actions lining up. But hopefully this provides a little bit more of a framework than I think we've had thus far in terms of pathway, strategies, and actions.
So again, and I think one thing we learned from last time's meeting, which was great, was that we tried to take each of your individual pathways, strategies, and actions from the different, sort of task groups. We'd have like 100 or something. So we're trying to kind of build a framework that we can then slot all of your good work under in these various levels. But first, any questions for Marion on this before we go to the actual pathways that our task group leads are suggesting for this group? Any questions about kind of the framework? Lauren, over to you.
Yeah, I'll just say this is really helpful, actually seeing definitions in front of us. I do think based on some of the strategies that a couple of the task groups created, they probably will be bucketed under actions, but it might be helpful in the future or just via email you share with us. You said you pulled out a couple of strategies that you think would be actions, just to show us an example of how we might tier them as we have a list of 100 plus, like Pat said. So thanks, Marion.
Yeah, happy to do that. Can send it in an email later if that'd be helpful. And I can pull out a couple of examples from your presentations last week and the week before to kind of show what I would, this is more of an action and more of a strategy for some examples. So happy to do that. That'd
be great. Thank you.
All right. So good. By the way, it's all leading back homework for the task group. So just be aware of that. Is we're going to circle back to this dream like, oh, great. Okay. So what the task group leads did is really had some great discussion and back and forth via email to try to take all of your good work in the task groups and try to imagine, a modest number of pathways that we can really communicate in part back to the Vermont Climate Council and then to the public at large for stakeholder input, while all of the good work you're going to do then is going to get kind of organized underneath this umbrella, right? So this is What we really want to do is have a discussion about the pathways today. Lauren's going to start us off with what's here, rich discussion. We can try to make changes as needed. And then from today, the homework will be the task groups need to go back and then slot their strategies underneath these pathways as described. Now, in some cases, there'll be overlaps and we'll figure that out next week because, like some conservation things may be kind of forest and working lands both or whatever, but we'll get back to that. But this will be kind of our organizing principle that then we'll send you all back to organize. And for folks who are worried about losing actions, we're not losing actions, right? All of that good work is going to be kept, advanced, detailed, slotted through equity and the MCA screen, all those things. It's just that we won't necessarily do this all at once, but we're definitely going to do it in the coming months. Okay, so Lauren, I'm going to turn this over to you maybe to kind of lay out some thinking about kind of the pathways that you all nicely developed.
Okay, I don't know that I have that much to say other than I'm excited to talk about this as a full subcommittee. When we met as a task group lead team on Wednesday, we talked about the pretty significant overlap within some of our existing pathways and the opportunity to kind of create a more concise but comprehensive pathways list that would touch down in each of the 4.5 task groups that we have. We started from a place of, there were like 15 plus pathways that we had as a full group. And then we had our individual task charges, as well as our 2-sentence statute charge for the full subcommittee, and kind of trying to work between those 3 tiers and understand how to incorporate the values that we've talked about as task groups and a subcommittee, while making sure we're touching down on all the different areas that our natural and working lands play with our built environment, as well as our natural environment. So this list of 7 or 8 is what our group, the task leads, came up with, but very, very draft form. Very much interested to see what you all think. If we've missed anything, I went through after we had these and looked at the nature-based solution strategies just to see if all of the strategies could fit under something or if there was something missed, and I didn't see anything. So that was at least a first trial run. And I don't know that I have much more to say other than that, Pat. Pat, thanks for getting it started for us and convening us earlier this week.
Totally. No, that's great. I think it's a good start. I think we want people to just dive in, ask questions, clarifications. If you have suggested word changes, if we really missed a big bucket, we should know that. So Marion, over to you.
I just wanted to add one thing because Lauren brought up a good point. When I think about strategies, they should all fit under pathways. And I think one way to think about if there's maybe a pathway that's missing that we need to talk about today is, are there certain strategies that you all see don't fit under these existing pathways? And if that's the case, it may be worth rewording as a pathway. So that may be a helpful place to start, because I think you all as task groups are familiar with the strategies you've developed. And if you don't see one that really fits there, that it may be worth a conversation about rewriting that as a pathway. So just thought that'd be a helpful place to start.
And the one thing to note too, as you look at this, you can see some of these are directed at things like land, water, et cetera. And some of the things are very directed at people, because we think obviously both those things are an important part of the story. So people take a minute and then love to get people's comments, reactions, because this is where we're going to kind of send you off to you. So we want to make sure we have it close enough to write. Judy.
Yeah, when we talked about fairness to all living and non-living things, that was to not make things like soil and water a thing, to make it a living entity. So is there equity included in all of these for that, or should it be a separate pathway?
That is a great question. Equity across all living things and equity for marginalized populations as well. So I think it's a great question. So I think people should have discuss.
Okay, speak to that or try to speak to that. I think what I'm envisioning, and tell me if this doesn't work with your thinking, Judy, is that within these, as we're that these pathways will have to, well, I'm not sure whether it'll be the pathways or the strategies that are put through the equity screen, but I worry about when we try to separate equity out. And so I would rather move forward with the assumption, and if we're not comfortable moving forward with the assumption, then somehow we should word it appropriately such that equity is tied into the language of the pathways. But I really want us to be, framing out the equity components within everything that we're thinking about, because otherwise I think it's just another silo, and that's not going to serve us well either.
I agree with you, Abby.
Change.
Yeah, I agree with you, Abby. The reason I brought it up is because equitable was used in the last pathway, and I didn't know if it was going to be separated out or included in all, but I do think it should be included at all. And I do think there should be a filter of some existence to pass everything through.
That's good. And my take is, I think for the screening tools, both for equity and the other tool, you have the MCA tool, I think that's probably gonna be done at the level of strategies, but and maybe even actions, but we'll have to come back to that in the coming weeks for sure. Okay, so I think, and I'm seeing some in the chat to Judy, that people agree with both, you and Abby's point, that really should be, part and parcel of all of these, not some separate bucket.
Right.
And this may get back to the values we want to name, and we'll have a discussion about that in a bit, including the value just named, Judy, about fairness to all living things. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think these are great. My only comment or question to Marion's point of, is there anything missing? I know our group talked about some kind of future research or analytical needs. And we could probably couch those under these pathways, but just curious if that's like a separate container we want to create, and don't need an answer right now, but just something for folks to think about.
Any thoughts about kind of R&D, so to speak, where that might fit? Or does that just fit under each of these where there's R&D that's needed for sequestration or for mitigation?
Yeah.
I could see maybe fitting that into the enhance and empower pieces, that the research, the R&D, or the more analytics could in theory serve to empower. And maybe, that's a lot, it's quite a lot of wordsmithing, but I could see how you could tuck it in there. But I think that's a good point, Billy. That is going to be really important, is to fill in the gaps of those pieces that we don't fully understand.
Right. And I think there's probably research needed under all these pathways. So as long as we all agree that we'll just put those under the appropriate pathway, I think that's fine. But I just wanted to ask the question.
Yeah. And I think you both are naming two really important cross-cutting issues: equity, incredibly important across all of these, and then research and development, kind of advancing technology, including not necessarily hard technology, could be an important part of all these too, or many of them. Any other thoughts on these right now? And again, we recognize this as iterative, so as we send you off to do some homework before next meeting, as you do this, just as Lauren did an initial screen herself, you may say, oh my goodness, we have these 3 strategies and they don't fit anywhere. And then we'll have that discussion next week when we come back to. Okay. All right, so anybody want to, do people think they can live with this as kind of, again, it's an iterative living set of tools here, but kind of live with this going forward to kind of help organize our work in the next few weeks to prepare for the Climate Council? Anybody have any concerns about using these to do that? All right, so I was gonna I'm gonna kind of know. So John, you comfortable enough with these for now? Okay, Lauren? Good. Abby? Charlie?
Yeah, I'd just say, Lauren, don't be afraid of that Oxford comma. No, I think
grammatical preference. Thank you, Charlie.
sorry,
I hate the Oxford comma.
I love it.
Yes.
Wait a second. I think we need to vote on this.
Yeah, Charlie, I'm with you. I love it.
Sorry, no, I
We have
think
to split.
you're great. I think actually going back through each of our task groups and trying to like slot them as you suggest is going to be the main test of this. But great spot to start.
Billy, you good for working? Yep. Judy?
Yeah, this is great.
Great. Billy, good. Judy, good. Melissa? Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Did I get all our members? Is Iris a member or liaison? I don't know quite how that works.
I believe she is a member.
We always welcome her input regardless.
Yes. Iris, what do you think? Yeah, I think it looks good.
Great. Thank you,
And
Iris.
Judy? Did we
Judy's
get?
good. Yeah.
Okay.
Judy, give a thumbs up. Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for now. So So here, I think is then the thing. We'll make these slides available right after. We have a slightly longer document that I don't know, task group leads, we can decide whether to share or not. This has just described this in a little bit more detail. So I think the task between now and next week is to take your many good strategies and actions and try to slot them into this. And then co-chairs are putting to talk about how to do this, but the thought is going to have you come back and present in this format, and we'll look across all the groups, and then we'll figure out, oh, these strategies go together. Oh my goodness, that's too much detail, whatever. We missed a pathway, whatever. So it's really kind of beginning to put our work together next week. So I think the task is that between now and next Friday. One of the challenges I think is that I try to do a little bit of this too, just playing with all the good work you guys did last week, is it gets confusing sometimes between a strategy and an action. And so I think you'll struggle a little bit sometimes to make that distinction. What Marion sends out as an example might help. And I think what we want to just keep in mind that we don't want to lose anything, but we don't have to do it all at once. So we want to prevent the Climate Council and the public at this stage kind of what you're thinking on a pathway and strategies, and maybe even some actions as samples to how to get to that strategy you may want to present, but we don't have to give them everything because it'll probably be just too overwhelming. And in the spirit of co-creation, we don't want to get too far ahead of everybody as we kind of develop this either. Okay, so before I talk about, we have a little conversation about values. Billy, Abby, any other clarity for next steps on this or actions or the like you guys want to share or raise or ask?
On which specific piece?
Yeah, just I guess on homework for the next week.
I think it's really just taking the definitions that Marion shared and developed around pathway, strategy, and action item, and the pathways which we just discussed, and then kind of organizing the work that the task groups have done heretofore under that rubric. And maybe we want to do more, but I think that's at a bare minimum what we need to do, right?
Right, that's right.
And in some ways, it might be helpful to stop at that, just so that when we're trying to collate everything to take it forward to the Climate Council presentation, which I'm assuming Billy and I are doing, or is that, I don't know how that's working. But that, yeah, keeping it at the level that is needed for the next step to present to the Climate Council will be helpful as we try to form that out.
Yeah. And
Does that make sense?
yeah, so I guess that begs a question. So the task groups do that work. Pat, do you envision they kind of provide it to Abby and I in advance of next Friday, and we try to compile it into one thing, or next Friday to each task group kind of run through their kind of pathway and strategy lists?
There's two things that have to happen simultaneously. So I'm not sure, Billy, to your question about how best to do it. The one is just like organizationally getting everything kind of tidy and consistent and dealing with overlaps. The other part is making sure you guys agree that's what you want to forward to the Vermont Climate Council. Right. So I think maybe we should take these in two stages. I want to test this. One is going to get the kind of the organization framework and consistency right. And then that's your question how to do that. And then once we do that, then we can look at the whole and say, okay, yes, we agree with that. No, we don't. We need some more discussion. And we do have next week and the week after to kind of do both activities. So I guess the question is, how fast can the task groups turn things around? And then how much time, Billy and Abby, do you need if you were to try to kind of synthesize this by next Friday? Lauren, over to you.
I think to your question, Pat, about how much detail or what we want to present to the council depends on what the council's doing with the strategies and pathways at the 26th meeting. I mean, my understanding is these are a draft suite of pathways and strategies that are going out to the public for like pretty robust public engagement. I don't think we don't have any prioritization criteria yet at the council scale. So I imagine I just wonder what's happening at the council, if you have any visibility on that. Maybe Marion, you can speak to it if you know yet.
Great question. Marion, I'm going to turn that to you. It's a great question.
Great question. I don't know yet. So I'll get back to you next week on potentially some Jane.
I mean, we don't like, I mean, I guess we don't know whether it's going to be kind of like, oh, this looks great, few questions, let's forward to the public process. Or it's gonna be like, they're going to really go, oh, I hate that one. No, let's not, we don't know how much like vetting the council's going to do vis-a-vis the subcommittee's work, right? That's probably what we want help with.
So maybe Abby and I need to think a little bit about this, but I think some expectation that task groups will have done the organization exercise before Friday, and ideally maybe in advance of Friday, so that we could kind of get everyone's work out to everybody else, so that you at least have an opportunity to review it before we meet next Friday. But at a minimum, be ready to present that by Friday. Go ahead,
I
Abby.
think that's a great idea. If we could do, even if it was by close of business on Thursday, that the task groups had fed that stuff out to the full subcommittee, so that when we gather on Friday, we're able to respond to the information, because I always find it difficult to do that on a screen first. So if people think that can happen, I think that would be really helpful.
I agree.
So again, I think then the task would be task lead those checks. So by close of business, which probably hopefully does mean 5, not 11, not midnight. So people can look at it at night or in the morning if they want to, would be to have your slides with these pathways and then your strategies underneath these pathways, right? And some pathways, maybe you're not gonna have any strategies in your task group, maybe you are, you'll sort that out. Send that around to everybody. We'll then have those presented briefly next week's meeting, and then try to kind of as a group make sense of them, do some synthesizing of this work together. And then there'll be the hard work of kind of getting that cleaned up and really beginning to make sure that's what you want to forward to the Climate Council, which maybe would be most of our focus on the 23rd. Does that work?
I like it.
Everybody feeling good with that? No, we're missing some people too, so.
And I know that the kind of forestry and natural lands task group isn't scheduled to meet next week, but I can check with you all, and maybe this is something that I can work with the staff on doing, and then we could just try to work through via email. So we'll see if that approach works.
Lauren, are you, because I know you're task lead, any questions for yours? You're good? Okay. Ryan, you good? Ryan, you're just unmuted too.
Yeah, I'm working to unmute myself. That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. Abby, you're good?
Yes. Yep.
Good. All right. Awesome. Okay, that's good. I think we've got a path forward. Thank you all. That's terrific. Speaking of pathways. Okay, I think the next piece we want to do is really take that step back and really referring back to really a comment Judy made. Judy, go ahead. Over to you.
A question. Both of the committees that I'm on, we have like a list of thoughts and questions that we're keeping track of, just to make sure they're not forgotten by other committees. Is there a bucket or a pathway that we can allow those questions, comments to just be shared?
That is a good question. I wonder, Marion, because there are probably a set of either questions or issues where a subcommittee is not sure whether it's theirs, but they want it to be attended to. So I do wonder if even in the slide deck that's asked back to the Climate Council, if each subcommittee can say, here's a few items, they belong somewhere, we're not sure where, or however you want to frame it. Judy, I think if that's your point.
Yeah. Well, it's things that they've come up in our conversations, but they're not really things we should address. And we've just kept track of them just to make sure they're followed through by other committees. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I agree with you, Judy, and maybe that's another piece that we all circulate at the end of this week, so that we all kind of can create one full list of those questions and tasks for other subcommittees. So maybe we should include that in whatever we share with each other at the end of the week.
So I'll call that a parking lot or bin list that you all have identified, that you just named. And then I think the other piece you might want to think about putting in those slides by next Thursday, if you can, is I just want to be cognizant of David, who's not here today, but David Mears said, we ought to rise up to the Vermont Climate Council key tensions or potential difficult trade-offs. So within your task group, if you think of those, you might want to put those in your slides too for next week, and then we can talk about them as a full group and if we choose to elevate them. Marion?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Judy, about Judy and Pat about, things you all have been trying to track that you aren't focusing on specifically, and then also tensions that exist. So a couple of things I didn't identify. One, so the slide deck that I'll be sharing with you all is a template to use by hopefully as soon after the steering committee on Monday as I can. It's sort of serving a twofold function, one for the presentation to the Climate Council, but also some of it will be used by Climate Access and Rise for some of their public engagement medium. So you'll notice, I mean, that's why we want all the slide decks to have the same theme and sort of the same format, so it can be used for future public engagement tools. For the question about, will there be an opportunity to sort of present either trade-offs or issues or things that maybe haven't been addressed that should be addressed with the council? I think that's certainly something we can bring up with the steering committee on Monday as we review the template with them. There is some space in the template right now for sort of presenting some, data or sort of broader statements about the issues you're trying to address, and that may be an opportunity to put some of those broader, conflicts or things that trade-offs you've identified once you all discuss that next week. So a couple of things I'm thinking. One, I can actually share just the basic part of the template with you all today that I don't anticipate changing. It's just sort of the pathway slide with the strategies underneath. If that's helpful for you all to start working out of those. And then the full presentation template will come to you all after the steering committee on Monday.
Co-chairs, do you want Marion to kind of distribute what she has today just as a working tool?
Yes, please. I love working tools.
Awesome. Great. Okay. So yeah, Marion, go ahead. Do you have another question? Oh, sorry. What we want to do now is talk a little bit about, again, and rather than trying to like pull them out of the meeting notes and stuff, and probably get it wrong, we really want to have a discussion with everybody here about what are the underlying they're not even pathways, they're just values, really. Like fairness to all living things is a good example, right? What are the values that you think undergird your work collectively that you want to be able to potentially name to the Climate Council as, we want you to be aware, here are some of the values that are driving our pathways, our strategies, et cetera. So we want to just kind of have a free-form conversation. We're not looking for consensus today, but we like to get people's ideas about those values, have some back and forth, agreement, disagreement, whatever. We're going to take some notes, and then we'll try to come back to you next week, with some sample values that we think we heard from the conversation for you all to kind of to chew on a little bit as well. So I want to kind of just open the floor, and when you think about, and maybe turn to Billy, have a few comments, is what are the values that really, kind of really underlie and inform the work that you're really trying to do here? Billy.
Well, thank you. And thank you for framing that up. But I guess before we even get there, I just wanted to kind of get some clarity as to whether this is, I know values were at the top of kind of our hierarchy of details, values, pathways, strategies, action items. Are values things that other subcommittees are exploring as well? I'm just trying to understand where this conversation fits into the larger picture. So this is more us saying that this is something we feel is important. Okay. Okay. So yeah, I know that I raised that there would be, from my perspective, there's value in having what I think I frame more as targets, like what are these pathways trying to achieve in a more kind of concrete and substantive way, and that there'd be some benefit in our group talking about what, we're kind of trying to work towards, what future state our pathways are aiming for in a more concrete way as a means to help us sort through and prioritize and kind of vet all of the recommendations we're going to make. I think that conversation with the task group leads expanded to not only kind of targets, but values, and like what is the kind of value proposition or the end goal that we're really trying to realize, both in the specific outcomes as it relates to climate, but more broadly, given the broad focus of our subcommittee. And, Lauren and Abby and others can probably state this more eloquently, but I think that's really what we're looking about right now, is like, what's the high level filter that we're really approaching this work through. And I welcome others to input on that.
And I think just, Billy, we make sure we're using the same terms too. So like, I think like if I was to say like, if a clear outcome or target might be, we want to conserve, I'm just winging a number, right? Like 90% of Vermont's forests. That would be kind of a very target outcome goal. But underneath that is a value, which is we care deeply about and want to, conserve Vermont's forests for whatever reasons. They're deeply important to our character, our living, our identity, whatever. And so they're linked, but they're sometimes often framed slightly differently. Judy, did you, I know were you gonna put some more
Yeah.
things out there?
I'm trying to copy them, but I can't. So I'll just read them. These are the ones that I said in the beginning. Does the practice support reducing energy use? Can the practice contribute to lessening man-made waste? Does the practice reduce destruction of natural environment? Is there fairness to all living things, human and non-human? And then respect, responsibility, reference, reciprocity, and relationships. Those are the values I submitted in the very beginning.
Judy, could you say the last one more time?
Respect, responsibility, reverence, reciprocity, and relationships.
Great.
I don't know why I can't copy them and paste them, but it's not working.
No worries, we got it. Thank you for doing that. Other thoughts about values that inform you, or to Billy's point, if there are very specific objectives you want to at least put out, we won't necessarily solve them today, nor will we probably put outcomes or objectives necessarily directly to the council just yet. But if people have thoughts on that, welcome to jump in on that as well. Other values that you believe inform your work.
I would include with the fairness to all living things, something I think a lot in regards to dignity.
Okay, great. And I know there was food sovereignty was mentioned.
And Iris just wrote, creating reparative justice pertaining to land management and ownership.
Great.
Which is simple.
Can I add Moody's list, especially all the R's at the end seem to represent so much. And I think one thing that's come up in a couple conversations of our groups that I think falls under there is kind of responsibility, but really taking responsibility for local production of food and taking local responsibility for the environmental impact of agriculture. And I think that's important kind of like background for the need to not just reduce agriculture to achieve our emissions goals, because those that footprint will be felt elsewhere outside the lines of Vermont.
Let's say it one more time here. Local responsibility for
food production and the environmental footprint of agriculture and the food that we eat. And I know that's not like succinct and eloquent into a short couple of words, but I really, if someone can say it better, I think we've often talked about just the importance of not just reducing agriculture to get our emissions down within our state lines, but realizing that, yeah, we can take responsibility for changing agricultural production to reduce footprint rather than just putting that in someone else's backyard.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent. Other kind of values you all are thinking you want to name are important to you that we want to make sure we're at least we surface and make explicit with each other. Some nice ones Lauren's putting in here. I'm copying these from chat where I have them, so it's good. Good. Seems in chat. Great.
I thought of one, but it completely left my head. So I'm going to try to call it back up.
Okay. Don't lose it. Come back. And again, we're taking notes and we can kind of serve these back to you all next week. But other thoughts? We'll see if people have another idea or two to give Abby. Oh, good.
Judy has spoken a lot about, and I think this really ties into a lot, is cultural humility.
Right. Good. Checking, there's one other thing in the chat. I'll check that. Billy?
No, something fell on my desk and made noise.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Clearly, I read the non-verbal cue wrong. Good. All right, so what we'll do is I'll take these back to the co-chairs unless people have other comments. We can do a little finessing and bring these back and then decide exactly kind of how precisely we'll use them. But I think it's helpful to kind of name these for each other, and they've really been nicely interspersed a lot of your conversation. Ryan, you had a comment.
Sure, thanks. I'll paste into the chat the Vermont Agriculture and Food System Strategic Plan. Their vision statement they have in there articulates, from my vantage point, it is specifically focused on the food system and less on the charge of this working group. But many of the values or goals, I believe, are framed in that those 4 paragraphs. And it is a place I've been looking that I think mirrors and articulates many of the comments I've heard. So I'm just going to paste that document in the chat and say that is a statement that I think also helps summarize or synthesize some of what I've been hearing, and definitely agree with what's been shared as comments to this point. Thanks.
Good. We'll take a look at that. Thank you. Good. Any other thoughts? I mean, I want to maybe Lauren, what you posted in the chat is good. Because of the nature-based solutions and kind of nature-based design, I might want to make sure we capture that notion that I think this group generally supports. Let's really build out and use nature both to do things for us and to design with us or guide us, as opposed to let's build concrete structures everywhere, right? So I don't know quite if maybe what you've already put in there captures that, but it seems like it's you guys really are leaning towards those kind of more nature-based systems and approaches to address things versus sort of more hardened or sort of classical engineering solutions. So,
and I'll go ahead, Alyssa, if you're going to say something. Okay, so I'll just put this out there that I think this is a really important conversation. I think this is one ideally we would have had much earlier in our process. I do see this personally as more of a value conversation internal to the subcommittee that we help to inform our consensus building and how we finalize our recommendations going forward. I don't see this as part of the kind of formal process that's set forth in the act. And if other subcommittees aren't really doing this, I think this is something that is really rich and valuable and relevant to the work that we're doing. And we can kind of use to raise awareness of our relative, value systems and help educate each other, and that we should do this. But from my perspective, that's its purpose, is really to help us understand where we're coming from, what's important to each of us, and the basis for the kind of decisions we make going forward as individuals within a subcommittee. I don't know if it has a broader implication than that. So just that's my initial thinking right now. If others feel otherwise, happy to have that conversation, but just want to kind of put that out there now is where my head's at.
Any quick reactions to Billy's thought about kind of how to use these?
Many of these, like, the equity pieces and whatnot are squarely baked into the act and things that all the subcommittees and the council will absolutely be using to filter the work. But some of these that are more specific to our group, I think, has that internal function that I mentioned.
Abby, were you gonna say anything?
I'm trying to think about, I agree in theory, and I understand, within the context of how we're working and the deadline we have, the wisdom of what Billy is saying. I do think, though, and maybe this comes at a later date in the council process after some of the public engagement or after we have some of the public input, but that values really, really matter. And if the other subcommittees, for example, don't embrace or don't share these values, then that's going to create an inherent tension in developing the climate action plan moving forward that could potentially cause us more trouble down the road when we're closer to putting that together. And so maybe this is a question for the full council level, or how are we going to resolve these broader tensions? Because I can certainly see that our values, I'm speculating, I suppose, but I'm quite certain some of our values are going to bump really hard up against some of the other subcommittees' strategies. And I think a lot of this is going to come out in the equity screening and in the guiding principles work. But, you know, I do think it's going to come up at some point, and I think that the process is not, this climate action plan isn't going to be any different than any other plan or any other work we've done if at some point we don't deal with some of these values conflicts. Just my
Maybe, sorry for the dog barking in the background. Apparently the poodle has spotted something terribly interesting. I wonder, Marion, whether this is probably a question back to the steering committee, which is, this group does feel values are important. We've explored them. Is this something we should really just be using to help us think through and inform our work at the subcommittee level, or is this something that actually the Climate Council as a whole needs to articulate in some way?
Yeah, I agree. And I think I was going to add that if you didn't jump in and say it. I think, yeah, definitely a conversation with the steering committee or the Climate Council as a whole. I think it's quite helpful that you all now have these documented, because we can use them and sort of show them to the steering committee and the council. Yeah, and I think it's worth asking sort of the practical question of, like, where does this fit into the planning process and the plan at the end, and then sort of the larger picture, which I think ties to something, Judy and Pat brought up about you all have been documenting sort of these conflicts or questions around other issues that you all are addressing that you're hoping other subcommittees will, and how do we reach consensus around those and ensure that those are being addressed. So Pat, I can add it to my list of things to check in with Jane and David on before the steering committee and see if we can fit that in this week.
Right,
or
Judy.
next week.
Thanks, Marion.
I presented to the Just Transition Committee the 4 sustainable questions that I asked. And I think Iris can speak to that because she was part of the negotiations for that, better than I can. But I think from what I read, they reworded the one about fairness to all living and non-living things in a little bit different way and put it into the guiding principles. And don't all the subcommittees have to follow the guiding principles?
Yes.
That's right.
Okay,
Yep.
So they may have reworded the other 3 and put them in there. I don't know, because I didn't recognize them, but I did recognize the fairness to all living things. So I don't know if Iris can say more about that or not.
Iris, dive right in.
Yeah, I know that we definitely took them into account. If they weren't recognizable, I think that's probably an issue, and they are an ongoing document. So I think that's something that I will definitely bring up at our next meeting, because I really want to make sure that they are recognizable, because they seem to be important principles. But yes, we definitely did take them into account, but I think it is an issue if they're not recognizable, because I think that means that they were changed in some way that is very important. So yeah, and then I do think that the guiding principles sort of serve as a values statement for the entire council. At least that's how I view them. And I think that's important, but I also think that there are values that are not in there because that's specific to equity. And I think that ties into everything, but there are values that do not, that aren't covered there. And I think that this conversation is something that's really important. And again, we probably should have had it earlier, but I'm really glad that we're having it now.
Thank you, Iris.
So that's really, I just wanted to kind of flag the fact that there is a little bit of a disconnect there. And I appreciate all your suggestions to kind of bring this forward to the steering committee and the council. And I think that makes good sense to me. So thanks for hearing me out on that.
No, I think it's good you raised it. Marion, maybe any quick final point on this, and I'll turn it really back to you for the next parts of the agenda. But Marion.
Yeah, just one quick point around, I think, Judy, around your point about, recognizing one of the questions you presented, but not some of the others in the guiding principles rubric. And then Iris, you could probably fill in more, but the Just Transition Subcommittee is taking feedback and still is on the guiding principles rubric, and they're doing a really good job and have a plan to review that feedback and respond to everything. So you could also reach out to them and sort of ask that those questions be clarified more if you think it's important that they be included.
Well, those questions were written for fourth graders, so I'm sure they used bigger words.
But I think to Iris's point, it would make sense that you actually be able to recognize them in there.
Yeah, I'll bring that up at the next meeting, and we should be able to make sure that those are put in the right way.
We all wrote to fourth graders. We'd probably all be better communicators. Okay, great. Well, Bill, I'm going to turn this back to you and Abby for kind of the next piece of the agenda as we finish up our last half hour.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We're making some good progress here. It's exciting. So we have about 15 minutes set aside for just kind of general unstructured discussion amongst the group. I know, without David here, we might have a hard time filling that 15 minutes. But we've got it on the agenda. So if there's anything folks would like to raise, if we'd like to continue threads that came up in this last conversation, that's fine too. So some follow up on Alyssa's presentation, anything that folks would like to kind of bring up with the group now, feel free to. We'll use as much of that time as we need, and then we'll move on to wrapping down the meeting. Lauren, thank you.
I'm very reticent to raise my hand without David Mears here because I'm not going to do him any justice. But since nobody else did, I'm curious, and this might marry together our past conversation just now with others, the need to have some type of prioritization framework that does instill these values cross subcommittee and eventually to the full council. And I want to raise that I think that process needs to happen sooner rather than later. So we're not, I don't know, we don't have to go to battle on like the 11th hour on how we're going to be prioritizing our work, and just recognizing that inherent tension that a lot of us, but especially me, I'm sorry for having to continue to ring the bell on this one, feel between the inherent value and need to do adaptation and resilience work to address climate change and the statutory requirement to actually reduce emissions. So just throwing it out there for how we're going to be, if there's any idea yet. I think I kind of already asked this earlier, but Marion, I know you're only a couple of weeks on the job, but just flagging the need to have a prioritization conversation, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Lauren. And I don't have a great answer right now, but I know that there have been conversations, at least about how to approach the prioritization framework, and thinking about a conversation that took place, I believe, at the last council meeting around ensuring that equity is really something that we're working to center and be a component of how strategies are prioritized. But the same with co-benefits, and the same with feasibility and cost effectiveness, and perhaps and the values, and then also, well, values could be factored in, and then do certain strategies help us meet those the reduction requirements as set forth in the Act. I know that I've been in a meeting with David Plum talking about what his idea for how we could start to think about a prioritization framework, but I won't do his explanation justice. So I think it's worth a conversation perhaps at the steering committee meeting next week to kind of bring that up and start thinking about that and how it's presented and sort of discussed with the Climate Council. He was sort of saying we have to be able to have a story about the strategies and the pathways and sort of how that ties to racial equity and justice, how that ties to co-benefits, how it ties to feasibility. And he sort of used the story terminology to talk about prioritization and how we weigh the strategies. But that's really all that I have detail on at the moment. So.
I'm not sure quite how to frame this, this is just sort of like throw things out of our head as they come up moment. So
you can do a little internal filtering if you want, but yes.
Oh, come on, Billy, what's the fun in that? So I know that we have guiding principles. I know we have equity screening. I also am not, I am still feeling unsure as to the power structure of all of this and how all of the work that's been done at this level is going to be utilized with integrity through the entirety of the process. I mean, historically speaking, the same communities lose out time and time again. And I know that we have the language around this now. I know that we're trying to do a co-creation with the public engagement piece. I think that we are doing everything that we can to forge a new pathway forward as we develop this climate action plan. But I'm curious about the how. That nobody has to answer this. I'm just trying to flag this thought that I'm having, you know, like we can do all this amazing work here in this subcommittee. And if it goes up into the broader climate council and, you know, the same old conflicts come up of renewable energy versus natural lands conservation versus farmland versus forests and all those things, how are we going to ensure that our results are different at the end of this? And I don't expect an answer. I'm just some food for thought to all of us as we continue forward. I think we do have the potential to really engage in a somewhat transformative process here. And so how are we going to ensure that it is and honors all the work that's been done?
Important question.
Too much
sure-
internal filtering, not enough?
I'm sure the founding fathers, Abby, had the same idea when they were trying to figure out whether they were going to have some transformative process as opposed to what those damn Brits imposed on them, you know, and happily destroyed what was here in the first place, you know. I mean, it's an interesting conundrum. I think I would suspect we all have a vision or hope, not a vision. We all have this light that we're all trying to head towards. Hopefully it's a non-energy using light that we're all trying to head towards. And, you know, I constantly, we think here of interactions, things that we do we do in state government that are have implications for what we want to do in our committee here, what we think. I have faith in this process, and I have faith that I operate in a business, agriculture, that is fundamentally good, you know, because we deal in the soil, we deal more closely with nature than I would say any of the other groups, any of the other subcommittees. So we're holier than thou kind of attitude I have, and I'm sorry. But I, you know, I think you just have to have faith, and you also have to have a big stick to rat knuckles.
Have faith and walk with a big stick,
Sure.
huh, John? I love it.
I do think that you know, the what Pat and Judy suggested earlier, that we include this week our kind of tension points and charges for other subcommittees is a good start to that conversation, because I think then we can start to at least articulate where we anticipate those rubs coming and make sure that they're on people's radar and that, you know, we clearly have a position regarding them. that will need to be reconciled at some point in the future. So I think that that's a good start in kind of getting that thing going, Abby.
Yes, I would agree. But see, I filled the time. We filled the time.
We still have 5 minutes.
Damn. I suppose
Um,
we can call it early too. I mean, call this section early if nobody has anything that they really.
yeah, I wanted to kind of just quickly think about, unless others have things they want to bring up, I got one more topic, just hit on briefly. Okay, and this goes back to kind of our process, and so next week we're gonna try to pull together and kind of consolidate our different pathways and strategies. And then the following week, we're gonna try to basically decide which ones we want to put forward to the committee the following Monday. Is that what you're thinking, Pat?
I have noise in the background. Yes, one thing I just want to, if I heard this right, Billy, I want to check with Marion, is we are going to work right up to to our meeting on the 23rd. So I'm hoping the Climate Council doesn't expect something like days before their actual meeting, because we're not going to get there. I don't think we or others are going to get there.
I've always understood that that's our deadline, is the 26th and not before, but Marion can correct me if I'm wrong.
I can't definitively speak to what the Climate Council expects for materials. I think it's great if we have materials posted ahead of the meeting, even if that's, a day ahead or on the evening of the 23rd or 24th ahead of the 26th. But yeah, I'm putting a lot on the steering committee on Monday, but perhaps they have some input on when they want to see this, these presentations ahead of time for the council.
Okay. Yeah, because at one point Jane even implied that like there wouldn't be discussion at the 26th, that was just going to be our deadline, but I sense that's probably changed.
Yeah, I think the hard thing we're trying to balance is that we have a set amount of time and there's going to be a lot to present. I think to your question earlier, and maybe Pat, you weighed in, but about you all deciding what to present, I think ideally you present all of your pathways and strategies, but that may require some work on, consolidating some of the strategies that may overlap in some capacity. Because I do think the council should see all of the ones you're proposing, not all of the actions. I think that would be a lot, but
Right.
Pathways should, it's not like you're going to present 4 of the 6 pathways.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm in part asking because from a selfish perspective that I am striving hard to make all of these meetings. The Friday, the 23rd is a meeting I may not be able to attend or do so in a less than ideal way. I'm going to be on vacation that week, and that morning is kind of like a travel day for us. So I'm going to do my best to kind of be here and be present on the 23rd, but I may have some challenges engaging. So we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And fortunately, Abby is a wonderful co-chair who could just run things in my absence.
Yeah, well, that remains to be seen, but fingers crossed.
Total confidence.
Show
Judy.
up however you can, Billy.
All right, Judy.
Yeah, I apologize that I missed a little bit of the first part of last meeting. So I don't know if Abby and Lauren mentioned this, but we did a presentation to middle school teachers at the Middle Grades Institute. And at the end, we asked them what it is that we could help them with. And I was kind of surprised with their answers, but they all agreed that they are having trouble teaching about climate change in their classes because of the community. They don't believe in it, and they don't want it taught. And so one of the things that they spoke to loud and clear was to ask for educational programs for communities. I thought that was interesting. I don't know if Abby or Lauren wants to add to it, but they found our presentation helpful, and I was surprised with their comments at the end.
It was really interesting, and if I can remember long enough, I'll try to find my notes from it, and maybe I can type something up and send it out to all of you, because it was really interesting to hear from an educator perspective. That is a perspective I feel like we haven't heard as much from in this subcommittee, and so it just was really interesting to hear the challenges that they face and the resources that they feel like they need, and thinking about just the importance of in terms of resilience and adaptation. How do you prepare the next generation for the skills that they're going to need to exist here, when there's conflict around the type of curriculum you can teach, or how it fits into the curriculum, or what the community is expecting or not expecting, and things like that. So it was a really interesting and valuable endeavor. Thanks, Judy, for including us with you.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thanks for doing that and for sharing about it, everyone. Okay, so any other kind of general comments, points of discussion for our group before we move on? Okay. That's a whole meeting in itself, Lauren. But I agree with you. So we're at the point of our agenda where we talk about kind of homework assignments and agenda for next week. I think we more or less covered that. By kind of late afternoon Thursday, task groups are going to get to the broader subcommittee, their organized pathways and strategies, so that we can consume those and be ready to discuss them next Friday. Anything else I'm missing, or folks want to add to that? Good. I think it is, Charlie. So with that, we have 10 minutes left this morning. Thanks all for the members of the public who've been participating this morning and observing. Anyone who's interested in speaking now and sharing questions, comments, perspectives are welcome to. Please identify yourselves by raising your hands in Zoom or making yourself known otherwise. Okay, so far I see Jennifer and Graham, I believe, or rural Vermont. I think that's Graham. Give it a second to see if anyone else pops up. Okay, great. So let's go in that order. Jennifer, take some time to address the committee. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for a great set of conversations today and the presentation, Alyssa. I had a comment about values and the pathways and equity. And then I also had a question for Alyssa about her presentation. The comment is just the complexity of incorporating those values. And I think it's very important that the Climate Council does that. And I also see the tensions that are going to arise by doing that. And I'll just say as an example, the pathways read very differently to me. I got all excited about them. I read through them and I thought, yes, these are terrific, and they are terrific. But then I got to the last one that included the word equitable in it, and it read entirely differently to me. And so this sort of goes back to Judy's original question of, is there a separate pathway that talks about equity? And it seems that you all agree, and I agree as well, that no, it should be embedded in each one of those. But honestly, if there isn't a word like equity or equitable written into each one of those pathways, it's completely lost, because I felt entirely different as I was reading through each one. And at the same time, it's going to read in sort of a funny way if the word equitable or equity is included in each one. But I think it is an important, what I would love is that values and equity were known and believed in by everybody. But the truth is they're not. So I just wanted to point that out, how it read to me as I was scrolling through them. The other thing that I wanted to sort of move back to Alyssa's excellent presentation, and I wanted to ask if that's going to be up on the Vermont Climate Council website. And I would love for it to be, because I would love to further educate myself. One of the things that really struck me, Alyssa, was that 0 to 20% range for organic matter in the soils. And I think your studies and your data are so important. I think that they can really influence as we move from pathways to strategies to actions. It seems like your data is going to be really revealing, maybe at a point that comes after certainly the pathways and the strategies, maybe, but I'm hopeful that some of that data will be available. And I guess the specific question I'm wondering about is, what do we know about that 0 to 20% range for soil organic matter, and thus probably soil carbon, and what support we can provide people to carry out those particular practices. So that would come down to the actions. What are we going to do as a state to provide farmers with the opportunity to sequester and store more carbon in the soil? Anyway, thank you so much.
Jennifer, just to respond, thanks for your comment, and also just thanks for your consistent just showing up and participating and listening to these meetings. I really appreciate that, your consistent presence. Yes, the information will be available. A lot of people wish we had done this kind of research years ago so we could have that data now, and it's good that we're doing it this year. I will share the PowerPoint and make that available, and then we'll have, hopefully in the next month or two, we'll have some reports and briefs come out to share information that's really relevant as soon as we get to it, and we'll have some publications probably later in the winter. Can you just clarify a little bit what you meant by the 0 to 20?
So I was thinking about, it was one of the slides, and your overall comment was gains are possible. In other words, yes, Vermont is doing a great job because we have an average of 5.3% organic matter in our agricultural soils. That's terrific. But you showed one slide that showed this range that had basically 0 to 20%. And so what I was curious about is what were the practices, and obviously some of it has to do with what the soil is like to begin with. And so I'm thinking that is an action of, here we can encourage farmers and we can provide farmers with support to do that. Anyway,
Great. Yeah, thanks. No, that's helpful. I wondered which piece you were talking about. Yeah, so that was this slide kind of sharing the different data sets that we have available to us that show us organic matter levels in Vermont ag soils. And some of those data sets are just from the soil testing lab at UVM. We also have the Cornell assessment of soil health tests that have been taken in Vermont over the last 6 years. And then the NRCS data, and then some that we've been collecting recently. And so if you're asking about kind of which practices put farmers at the higher end of organic matter content, that's not something that's part of those data sets. But certainly the research that we're conducting now will be able to do some explanatory analysis, because in addition to collecting all this information about soil carbon, we're asking farmers to fill out a short survey about management on those fields. And so we'll be able to do some, multivariable regression analysis to say how much of this is just based on having clay content in your soils, and that's has a high affinity for carbon, which are the leverage points in terms of management that have the biggest impact on the outcomes that we care about. So there certainly is other research that has been done to that, but we'll have some really Vermont specific connections, and I don't have that yet, but we will.
Great. Thank you both for that. And we will get those slides up. Graham, if you're still interested, the floor is yours.
Hey folks, this is Graham Unix, roofing off from rural Vermont. I'm going to keep my video off because I'm losing connection on and off, and I have a phone line here connected, but I think I'll be patchy on the video. So yeah, thank you for all the conversation today, and Alyssa, thanks for that. You fit, I don't know how long that normally takes you, 2 or 3 hours maybe, but you fit that in less than 30 minutes, I think. Pretty amazing. You know, one pathway that I was thinking about, just wanted to maybe have you all consider, I believe comes directly from statute that could be included, and that's limit the use of chemicals, substances, or products that contribute to climate change. So there could be something specific to that to consider, and we'll go more into detail on that in our comments. And then most of my, or a lot of my comments now are just questions for Alyssa. I realize that she won't be able to take them now, so maybe they're just considerations or questions for the group to consider in relation to the presentation. But I was curious about measurement, and I've asked Alyssa this before a little bit, is curious about measurement below 30 centimeters under different soils, geologies, management. And I'm curious about that for different reasons. You know, I think some practices intentionally try to cultivate deeper than 12 inches. Some sites have very different soils or geologies. For example, I'm grazing on one site in Calais right now where it's very close to bedrock, but the site where I'm hoping to move my animals to is incredibly deep silt loam in a river bottom. So different potentials for root growth and for carbon storage. I really appreciated seeing the prioritization of agroforestry in the matrix a couple of weeks ago, and I wonder sort of perspectives on whether current metrics, especially at 12 inches or so, the 30 centimeters, if you think they have means of adequately measuring total carbon on the site, especially in integration of woody plants, high residual grazing versus short hang or continuous grazing, and how that above ground carbon and below ground carbon could be sort of maybe more holistically considered, or if there are metrics for that. As we go through this, I think one question and consideration related to equity that comes to me often is, you know, how much investment is required to achieve different outcomes based on different practices or infrastructure? And how does equity and desire to support accessible ag in a greater number of farms affect decisions related to capital intensive projects on a smaller number of farms? And I think that's a tension that will be there for not only this subcommittee, but I'm sure a lot of other investments that folks are thinking about making. Generally, more holistic perspective on carbon on the farm ag sites like throughput. And I've talked a little with Alyssa about this before, and it sounds like it's challenging to consider, but you know, what's in the soil, what's above ground, what's used from fossil fuels equipment, pesticides to get there, what type of economy and transportation systems that plug into, like, you know, can we get a different, more holistic perspective to some extent? How can we build that into what we're doing here, especially if our future vision really, you know, incorporates a lot of those things, but we may not know how to do it right now. I was curious, like, what the measurement of soil biology you mentioned was, Alyssa. I'm just gonna keep going because I know you don't have time to answer all this, but I thought that the importance she talked about was social capital and a social safety net and sort of financial safety net was really important. And, you know, some climate strategic plans like Drawdown really offer a diversity of recommendations, even related to education, et cetera. But I want the group to consider recommendations related to social and financial needs and safety nets. And I'd refer you to the briefs that Rural Vermont lead authored on healthcare and childcare for the Vermont Ag Strategic Plan, and the work nationally of Shoshana Inwood and Florence Beckott on the impacts of healthcare and childcare and other sort of quote unquote household issues on agriculture, because I think they also have a real impact on climate resilience and adaptation and equity. I really love the piece on reliable local markets, and we've talked about this a lot at Rural Vermont, you know, and I'm curious, Alyssa, if you saw if there were any particular types and scales of farms that you heard this more from than others. It makes me wonder about like parallel program opportunities to what this group and the PES group have been working on. Like, is like a government supported market that could support a guaranteed purchase of a certain amount of a farm's crop at a certain high price as sort of an environmental program you could qualify for, et cetera. Like, just to consider an idea like that. The site level water planning was really interesting, and I think this group's thinking about maybe getting some education on micro and macro water cycles and global cooling could be really interesting to think about. You know, there was a question asked about the amount of land that transitioned into cover crop, and I think that the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition, John and Heather Darby, I feel like you've all presented on that within your coalition, like how many acres have transitioned, and so I think those folks have some of that data. And lastly, I'd say, like, I think that discussing values and a future state or a vision is really important. I think it'll help capture some of the bigger trends and dynamics and systems we'll need to see, which may not be captured currently in particular metrics or otherwise, and figure out how to assess and address in more detail now in order to achieve this vision. And it'll also daylight some different visions and assumptions I think that different folks are coming with. And that's it. Sorry to take up so much time. And I wish I could hear your responses now, Alyssa, but maybe we'll touch base at some point. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Graham. Good questions. Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for your participation today. Good work. And be in touch with Abby and I if you have any questions. Otherwise, we will see you all next week.
Also, I just want to say really quickly, I know it's summer. I know there's vacations going on. I know we've been locked in for so long. And I just want to take a second to say I really appreciate everybody continuing to show up and contribute and do the work. Really means a lot. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you, co-chairs.